Well, come to the sinister archives. Before we going into this forbidden history, I want you to do something for me. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it there right now. Tell me in the comments right now. It matters more than you think. And subscribe our channel for more historical stories. You weren't supposed to hear this. What I'm about to tell you was buried, not forgotten, buried with intention, like a body that should never resurface. Imagine this. Arkansas, 1871. A wooden chapel rises out of the forest, its beams smelling of fresh pine and beeswax, its stained glass glowing like fire in the dark. Families gather, singing hymns they half recognize, under the gaze of a man who speaks with a voice too commanding, too precise, like every word has already been measured against your bones. They believe they are entering a house of God, but what they are walking into is a structure engineered for something else, something far older and far less forgiving. And yet, if you search today, the Lawson Chapel does not exist. Not on maps, not in church archives, not in the official story of Arkansas Hills. The record was erased, surgically, but fragments remained just enough for historians to stumble over and just enough to terrify the ones who understood what they had uncovered. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The settlement of Arkansas Hills was small, temporary, and in theory unremarkable, a cluster of farms, a sawmill, and a trading post. But in March of 1871, a stranger arrived, Reverend Thomas Lawson. No wife, no children, just an unusual air of authority and letters of reference that decades later turned out to be fictions. He purchased 5 acres near Timber Creek, a limestone outcropping with a spring so clear the locals called it the Mirror Water, and almost immediately he began to build. The structure he raised was unlike other fronti, chapels, tall ceilings, central pulpit, colored glass windows imported from St. Louis, a cost no ordinary preacher could afford. More unsettling was his obsession with the spring. The entire chapel was built in alignment with its flow, stone foundations wrapped around the basin like a cage. Beneath the pulpit, a hidden cellar carved directly into the rock. When locals asked about this design, Lawson dismissed their concerns. The spring, he said, was blessed, but his journals, discovered almost a century later, reveal another explanation. The waters must flow beneath the altar space where the resonance is strongest. What resonance? What was he tuning the building for? The first services seemed normal. Hymns, scripture, the smell of pine beams and candle wax. But the Reverend had a way of altering things, small at first, a prayer repeated 3 times instead of once, congregants standing in strange patterns marked on the floor. By Christmas, witnesses said the gatherings had changed into something else. Music no one recognized drifted out of the chapel on moonlit nights when no service was scheduled. Parishioners left changed, eyes dilated, speech slowed, as though carrying something home in their blood. Then came the first collapse. Mrs. Langley, a mother of 4, fell shaking in the middle of service, speaking words no one could understand. The Reverend called it the First Awakening. Instead of fear, he smiled. That smile would become a pattern, a silent signal that something irreversible had begun. What followed was worse. Families divided, some pulled their children away, others went deeper, staying after midnight, returning home pale and hollow-eyed. The Reverend began preaching of vessels, of flesh as sacred instruments, of voices in the water that only the chosen could hear. He spoke of ancient harmonies, wisdom older than Scripture, languages not Greek, or Hebrew but older, primordial, and always the spring was the center. Think about that for a moment. Water that never changes temperature, water that hums if you listen closely enough, and a preacher who claimed he could open the channels between worlds through resonance, through sound. This is not just history. This is a map of control, a design. And tonight, you are stepping into the same structure those Arkansas farmers once entered. The deeper you go, the more you will understand why this chapel was erased, why even now officials dismiss the story as folklore, a hoax, a phantom. But there are names, there are diaries, there are fragments of testimony too precise to be invention. And they tell us one thing with certainty. Once the waters touched you, you were never the same again. By the autumn of 1871, the Lawson Chapel was more than a building. It had become a magnet. Families traveled miles through the rough Arkansas backwoods to hear a preacher who spoke with a cadence unlike anything they had ever known. Witnesses later said his sermons seemed less like scripture and more like incantation, measured rhythms that bypassed reason and moved straight into the body. Men described feeling their chests vibrate when he spoke, as though his words carried weight beyond sound. Women confessed to being pulled into trances where time collapsed, where the service seemed to last minutes, though hours had passed. Lawson introduced subtle changes no one dared challenge. The old Baptist hymns were slowly replaced by new chants, strange phrases repeated over and over until they lost meaning and became pure vibration. Parishioners stood in patterns marked on the floor with chalk, spirals and concentric circles aligned with the pulpit. From the high windows, colored light fell across their faces like stained glass brands. At first it was dismissed as eccentricity, but then people began to change. Dr. Holloway's notes, drawn from the few surviving journals of that congregation, describe a chilling transformation. By winter, several families reported persistent ringing in the ears that grew stronger during the night. Some spoke of vivid dreams where they walked beneath black waters, hearing a choir that was not human. A local physician, Dr. Whitfield, wrote to a colleague that patients from the Lawson Chapel all shared identical symptoms, yet none wished to be cured. They called it the awakening. What unsettled Whitfield most was the change in their bodies. Skin turned pale, almost translucent at the fingertips. Eyes dilated unnaturally wide, reflecting candlelight like glass. Families who once argued at supper now spoke in eerie unison, finishing each other's sentences as though one voice flowed through many throats. When Whitfield confronted Lawson about these developments, the Reverend only smiled and said, "The vessels are aligning." This phrase appears again and again in the records that survived. The vessels are aligning. Parishioners were no longer treated as souls to be saved, but as instruments to be tuned. Flesh was not fallen. It was clay, to be reshaped by frequency and water. The spring beneath the chapel was central. The Reverend claimed it carried currents older than Scripture, older than man, and that only through resonance could those currents awaken what was dormant in human blood. The architecture of the chapel itself reinforced this design. The beams were cut at angles calculated to amplify sound. The central pulpit was positioned directly above the underground basin where the spring flowed. Lawson's own journal contained precise measurements. 33 feet by 21, ceiling height 12, alignment essential. Waters must flow beneath the altar where resonance is strongest. This was not religion, it was engineering. The chapel was a machine. And then came the first disappearance. In April of 1872, Jackson Mercer, one of Lawson's most devoted followers, failed to return home after a late-night gathering. Lawson told the congregation Mercer had been called to spread the word elsewhere. Yet Mercer left no belongings, no provisions, not even a farewell to his family. Weeks later, his wife received a letter, supposedly in his hand, describing his missionary work in another settlement, but the handwriting was wrong. The words cold, foreign. She confided to her sister that at night she heard her husband's voice calling from beneath the floorboards of their cabin. Others reported the same phenomenon, voices of the missing carried in the walls, in the streams, in the ringing inside their skulls. Still the congregatee did not rebel. If anything, the disappearances drew them deeper. Those who doubted stayed away. Those who believed surrendered themselves completely. The ledger that survived lists 27 names under the heading Vessels Prepared, with cryptic notes beside each entry: waters received, resonance achieved. By the summer of 1872, the Lawson Chapel was no longer a church, it was a threshold. The community outside whispered of madness, delusion, even witchcraft. But for those inside the circle, there was no going back. They had tasted something beyond the ordinary world, and it had begun to reconfigure them from within. What was awakening in them? What was the purpose of this transformation? The answer lies not in Scripture, but in something far darker, the belief that the human body itself could be remade into an instrument capable of channeling forces that did not belong in the human realm. And Lawson, always calm, always smiling, was the conductor of this terrible symphony. By the spring of 1872, the heart of the Lawson Chapel had shifted underground. The cellar, which Lawson first described as a storage chamber for baptismal supplies, became the true altar of his ministry. It was carved directly into the limestone, the spring water diverted into a stone basin that glowed faintly by lantern light. Those who entered spoke of the air being thick, vibrating, as if sound itself had a physical weight. The deeper communion, Lawson called it. And only the chosen, those who had shown signs of the awakening, were invited below. The rituals were always at night. Witnesses who later fled the congregation described the pattern with disturbing clarity. First came 3 days of fasting, followed by night-long gatherings above the spring. The congregation stood in spirals traced on the floor with chalk, chanting phrases Lawson insisted were translations of older tongues, languages that, in his words, shaped the waters of creation. The chants would continue until exhaustion forced the weaker ones to collapse, but for those strong enough to endure, the true ritual awaited below. In the cellar, Lawson sat at a strange instrument, an organ of sorts, though heavily modified. Instead of simple pipes, tubes extended downward into the water basin. When he played, the vibrations did not merely echo, they seemed to shimmer through the stone itself. Parishioners reported hearing notes not with their ears, but inside their bones, as though their marrow were being tuned like strings. One woman described it as the singing beneath, a harmony that resonated from somewhere deeper than sound itself. Then came the immersion. Lawson would place his hands upon what he called the sacred points of resonance, the throat, the chest, behind the ears, before lowering the subject into the spring. The water, always unnaturally cold yet never freezing, flowed over their skin as the organ's tones filled the chamber, and something happened. Not at once, not always visibly, but those who rose from the basin were changed. Their movements slowed, their eyes dilated into black pools that reflected no light. They spoke softly of visions, of voices rising from beneath the earth, of cities made of stone and glass far below rivers, of a presence in the deep that had always been there, waiting. Dr. Holloway uncovered Lawson's own notes describing these rituals, scrawled in the margins of his journal. One passage, dated May 1872, reads, "The membranes are forming cleanly. The auditory structures adapt faster than expected. Already she perceives the harmonies without prompting. The flesh remembers. The vessels align themselves to the deeper currents once exposed. The language is clinical, detached, as if Lawson viewed his parishioners not as souls, but as subjects, experiments in a larger design." The most disturbing account came from Elizabeth Harden, wife of the man who had sold Lawson the land. In her diary, preserved only in fragments, she wrote of watching her neighbors return from these ceremonies. Their eyes no longer belonged to them. They spoke in low tones, as if listening to another voice carried through their own. The Reverend told us the waters were only waking what had always been inside us, but I swear on the grave of my mother, what came back from that basin was not the same as what went in. By midsummer, nearly 30 members had undergone immersion. Families who once lived ordinary frontier lives abandoned their farms to spend every waking hour at the chapel. Outsiders who attempted to question them were met with blank stares, followed by unsettling smiles, all identical, all rehearsed. The phrase, "we are aligned," became their mantra, whispered in unison when pressed for explanation. What was Lawson creating? His own writings leave no doubt. He believed the human body was an unfinished instrument, capable of being tuned to frequencies that would make flesh permeable between worlds. The spring was not holy water, it was a conductor. The organ was not for hymns, it was a key, and the chapel itself, with its calculated dimensions, was a resonating chamber built to amplify what should have remained silent. The disappearances multiplied. More men vanished without explanation. Their wives received letters in unfamiliar handwriting, insisting they were alive, spreading the word elsewhere. But the voices in the walls betrayed the truth. Their presence lingered, not in flesh but in resonance. The community outside Arkansas Hills grew afraid, whispering of witchcraft, of devilry, but they could not prove what was happening inside the chapel. Only those who went down into the cellar knew, and by then, most of them were no longer able or willing to leave. The Lawson Chapel had become a gateway, not to heaven, not to salvation, but to something far older, waiting in the dark water beneath the stones. By late summer of 1872, the Lawson Chapel was no longer a church in the sense that Arkansas Hills understood. It had become a living organism, a structure pulsing with rituals that reshaped its congregation, binding them together in ways no one could untangle. And those who had undergone the immersion began to display changes so profound, so undeniable, that even the skeptics of the settlement whispered of them with dread. Dr. James Whitfield, the physician who once tried to dismiss the strange ailments as delusion, wrote a letter to a colleague in Fayetteville that survives only in fragments. His words are chilling. They no longer move as individuals. Their joints, their very postures, carry a fluidity that is unnatural, as if bones no longer restrict them. Their skin is pale and almost translucent, especially around the hands and neck, where I believe the tissues themselves are undergoing alteration. When I tested reflexes, their responses were delayed but synchronized, as if the stimulus traveled through all of them at once. The Mercer family was his primary example. Jacob, his wife Rebecca, and their son Thomas were among the earliest to surrender fully to Lawson's teachings. By August, they were rarely seen outside the chapel. When Dr. Whitfield visited them, he noted their uncanny unity. They spoke in overlapping phrases, completing each other's thoughts without hesitation. Sometimes they spoke in unison, their voices merging into one chord. And when asked about this phenomenon, they only replied, "The waters have aligned us." Neighbors confirmed these strange behaviors. One farmer swore that he saw the Mercers standing in the creek for hours, motionless, their fingers trailing in the current. At dusk, he claimed their skin shimmered faintly, as though catching light from beneath the water instead of above it. Another reported hearing their voices from half a mile away, singing not hymns but droning tones that carried unnaturally through the forest, vibrating in his chest until he had to flee. Lawson encouraged this evolution. In his journal, he recorded the Mercer boy as an exceptional vessel, noting that the membranes between his fingers were beginning to fuse into translucent webbing. Lawson praised this as a sign of readiness. The boy hears more clearly than the others. His channels are opening. The flesh adapts when the spirit surrenders. These words, discovered decades later, still burn with a cold detachment that suggests Lawson did not see the changes as grotesque, but as progress, a fulfillment of his hidden doctrine. And the congregation followed willingly. They believed they were chosen to become more than human, vessels capable of channeling what Lawson called the deeper harmonies. He told them the flesh was sacred architecture, that the body itself was a chapel when tuned correctly. And once it was tuned, the boundaries between flesh and water, between life and what lay beneath, would dissolve. Outside observers, however, saw only corruption. A visiting minister, Edwin Campbell, wrote to his superiors in Little Rock that Lawson's theology contained elements foreign to our tradition. He described books in Lawson's study written in unknown tongues and an instrument, part organ, part water-driven contraption, that Lawson claimed could call those who dwell in deeper harmonies. Campbell left Arkansas Hills unsettled, warning others not to return. His letter is one of the last documented outside attempts to confront Lawson before the chapel was abandoned entirely. But inside, Lawson's power only grew. He organized the congregation into circles, outer, inner, and deepest. The outer circle were the cautious families who still attended Sunday gatherings. The inner circle were those who had begun the awakening, and the deepest circle were the vessels, those who had been fully immersed, their bodies already reshaping under the influence of the waters. These circles mirrored ancient mystery cults, but here they were hidden beneath the guise of a frontier chapel. And then came the voices. By September, reports spread of strange sounds heard in the woods at night, low, droning harmonies that seemed to move through the trees. Settlers claimed that the very earth vibrated, as though hollow. Dogs refused to approach the chapel grounds. Horses panicked when led past Timber Creek, and yet the congregation walked with serene smiles, as though carrying some great secret. The settlement itself began to fracture. Families who resisted Lawson moved away. Those who remained either surrendered to him or lived in fear. Arkansas Hills, once a frontier outpost, became a divided community orbiting around a single structure that no longer felt human. What was Lawson awakening in his congregation? Was it faith, Or was it something older, waiting to be given flesh again? His journal hints at an answer. When the harmonies are complete, the waters will no longer merely reflect. They will reveal. The Lawson Chapel was becoming a mirror, not of heaven, but of something far beneath the surface. And the congregation was no longer a flock. They were instruments. By the autumn of 1872, the sermons inside Lawson Chapel had changed completely. Gone were the familiar rhythms of Baptist worship, replaced by cryptic teachings delivered with a precision that left no room for doubt. The Reverend no longer preached of salvation through Christ. He spoke of resonance, of vessels, of the flesh as an instrument waiting to be tuned. To the ordinary ear, it was madness. But to those who had undergone immersion, his words resonated with terrifying clarity, as if he were naming what they already felt inside their blood. And the source of this doctrine, Lawson insisted, was not his own invention. It was the water. He told his deepest circle that the spring beneath the chapel was older than Scripture, older than mankind itself. It carried harmonies that existed before language, before time. The waters remember, he would say. They sing with voices older than creation, and we, if we are prepared, can join their song. His followers believed him because they had already begun to hear it. Some described whispers in the night, low tones rising from beneath the ground. Others claimed the sound was not in their ears at all, but in their bones, in the marrow vibrating like a struck chord. The Mercer family were among the first to lose themselves entirely. After their son Thomas's second immersion, neighbors said his voice no longer sounded like a boy's. It carried a depth unnatural for his age, layered with echoes, as if more than one voice spoke at once. Rebecca, his mother, began to speak in her sleep, repeating phrases no one understood, her tongue moving with a rhythm that mimicked Lawson's chanting, and Jacob, the father, was seen walking alone in the woods, arms raised, murmuring into the night air, as though answering something invisible. When questioned, he only replied, "The waters speak, we listen." Dr. Holloway's reconstruction of the even tense, it reveals something even darker. Among the fragments of Lawson's journal she uncovered, one passage stands out. They are no longer merely hearing. The channels have opened. Their flesh is becoming porous, their voices inhabited. The waters provide the harmony, the vessels provide the resonance. What dwells beneath is preparing to speak through them. Possession. That is the word modern readers cannot ignore. But in Lawson's language, it was alignment. He did not believe his congregation was being overtaken by foreign entities. He believed they were being perfected, transformed into conduits through which something far older could flow. And this belief was not confined to scripture or metaphor. He recorded his observations clinically with the detachment of a scientist. Subject 14, voice carries secondary tones when agitated. Subject 21, skin translucence now sufficient to reveal vessels beneath. Subject 8, reports hearing names in the water, though does not yet comprehend their meaning. Advancement, promising. The townspeople outside Arkansas Hills grew increasingly alarmed. They whispered of strange sounds in the night, droning choruses carried on the wind, too coordinated to be animals, too unnatural to be men. Travelers passing near Timber Creek claimed the ground itself seemed to hum, a deep vibration that left their teeth aching. One man swore he heard voices rising from the water, calling his name, though he had never set foot in the chapel. Yet the congregation only grew more fervent. For them, the changes were not afflictions, they were blessings. They believed they were joining a greater harmony, becoming something more than human, and Lawson's smile, always calm, always precise, assured them that they were chosen. But behind that smile, in the private pages of his journal, a darker truth emerges. He wrote of the voices beneath the spring, of presences that had waited patiently in silence, needing only vessels to carry them back into the world. The waters do not create, he wrote, they reveal, they return, they remember what once dwelled in flesh, and they will shape flesh again. By December of 1872, the Lawson Chapel was no longer a house of worship. It was an instrument, a resonating chamber built to amplify voices that did not belong to man. The congregation had become a choir, and Lawson, whether preacher or conductor, had given them over to something that whispered beneath the ground, waiting to be sung into existence again. The possession was no longer symbolic. It was physical, it was visible, and it was only the beginning. By the winter of 1872, Arkansas Hills was no longer a functioning settlement, but a village under siege, though the siege came not from raiders or famine, but from within. The Lawson Chapel congregation had withdrawn almost entirely from ordinary life. Farms lay untended, animals starved in their pens, and smoke ceased to rise from chimneys. The chapel itself became the sole locus of activity, glowing with lamplight long into the night, its stones echoing with sounds no sane ear could mistake for hymns. Those who had not joined Lawson described a kind of invisible boundary forming around the congregation. They did not bar outsiders with weapons, but with presence. When townsfolk approached, aligned families would gather silently at the chapel doors, staring with unblinking eyes until the intruders retreated. It was not overt violence, but something worse, a unity so absolute it drained all courage from the heart. One farmer said, "They stood there, 30 of them, not saying a word, but I felt as if I'd stepped into a dream where nothing belonged to me anymore, not even my own thoughts." Inside, the rituals intensified. Lawson no longer used the organ only for immersion but for nightly convocations. The instrument's tones pulsed through the cellar, reverberating in the stone walls until the whole structure seemed to breathe. The congregation responded as one body. They swayed, they sang in chords too precise to be human, their voices blending into something that sounded less like song than like the shifting of the earth itself. The rhythms were irregular, inhuman, yet carried a structure that suggested intelligence. Dr. Holloway later noted that Lawson's journal shifted in tone at this time. His earlier entries bore the cadence of a preacher seeking divine truth, but by January of 1873 his writings resembled the log of a conductor recording a performance. The harmonies deepen, synchronization improves. Last night, 23 voices held the resonance for 11 minutes without faltering. The stone trembled, the water rose. It listens. The water. That was the key. Witnesses, few though they were, claimed that the spring beneath the chapel had begun to change. Its surface rippled constantly, even in stillness, as if stirred by unseen currents. Lantern light shone oddly on it, refracting not as water should, but bending into shapes that did not match the angle of the flame. Some swore they saw faces in it, shifting, half-formed, glimpsed only in the periphery. The aligned spoke of these visions openly. "They are waiting," one parishioner said. "They are learning our tongues through us. Soon they will speak." Possession deepened into collective hysteria. Entire families now spoke in voices not entirely their own. Infants cried not in wails but in harmonic tones that unnerved even their altered parents. Children recited words beyond their years, guttural phrases that seemed memorized without ever being taught. And through it all, Lawson stood calm at the center, his hands upon the organ, conducting the rising chorus. By February, the chapel had become impenetrable. Outsiders who attempted to enter found the doors locked from within. At night, strange lights were seen flickering through the cracks in the stone, blue-green like lanterns held beneath water. The sound of chanting carried for miles, sometimes joined by low rumbles that shook windows in distant farmhouses. Dogs howled all night, horses bolted in terror. Yet within the chapel the congregation thrived, their numbers reduced but their unity absolute. One final entry in Elizabeth Harden's fragmented diary captures the horror of those months. "They are not my neighbors anymore. They move as one, they speak as one, they breathe as one. I saw them at the creek last night, the unborn, 30 of them, waist-deep in the water, though it was ice. They held hands and sang without words, and when the moon struck the surface, I swear I saw something vast staring back at me from beneath, as if the earth itself had opened an eye." By the spring thaw of 1873, Arkansas Hills was a ghost town. The remaining families fled, leaving only the aligned within the chapel walls. Whatever dwelled beneath the waters had found its choir, and Lawson, whether prophet or pawn, had sealed them off from the world. The chapel was no longer a church. It was a hive. By the spring of 1873, Lawson's congregation was no longer confined to ritual within the chapel. Their unity had spilled outward, bleeding into the surrounding woods and creeks, transforming the very landscape of Arkansas Hills into an extension of their worship. What had begun as immersion and chanting in the cellar evolved into a collective movement that carried through every waking hour. Travelers spoke of encountering groups of aligned wandering the forests in perfect silence, moving in patterns too deliberate to be coincidence. They walked in concentric circles or in parallel lines that bent subtly with the shape of the land, as though mapping unseen geometries into the soil itself. Those who attempted to speak with them received only blank stares, followed by the murmured refrain, "We are aligned, the waters remember." Then the group would continue their movements without pause, their feet leaving no discernible trail in the earth. The Mercer boy, Thomas, was seen most often during these excursions. Witnesses described him standing at the edge of Timber Creek, his arms raised, speaking in tones too low for the human ear, yet vibrating in the chest of anyone nearby. One settler swore he saw fish rise belly up to the surface as the boy spoke, circling slowly before sinking into the current. Another claimed that when Thomas fell silent, the creek itself continued to echo his tones for several minutes afterward, as if the water had learned his voice. And there were disappearances. Not just of Lawson's own flock, but of outsiders who strayed too close. A pair of trappers passing through the valley vanished without a trace. Their abandoned camp was found, but not their bodies. A letter from a merchant in Fayetteville mentions his brother, last seen traveling the Arkansas Hills Trail, whose horse returned without a rider, eyes wide in terror. The merchant wrote bitty, early. "They say he went to the chapel. If that is true, then I know already he is lost." Dr. Holloway's examination of Lawson's surviving notes suggests these vanishings were not accidents. In one entry he wrote, "The waters require new vessels. The choir must be replenished. Strangers provide strong flesh, uncorrupted by fear." This implies that Lawson or the congregation itself was actively drawing in outsiders, not to convert them willingly, but to sacrifice them to the resonance. The aligned began leaving tokens on doorsteps, shells filled with water, stones arranged in spiral patterns, fragments of chalked symbols smeared onto wood. At first, these seemed like meaningless gestures, but as weeks passed, settlers noticed a disturbing correlation. Those who received the tokens soon fell ill, complaining of ringing in the ears, of dreams filled with water, of voices whispering beneath their floors. Some resisted and fled. Others, weakened, eventually walked of their own accord toward the chapel, never to be seen again. The hive-mind unity of the congregation grew more menacing with each passing week. Outsiders who dared approach reported hearing not words but choruses issuing from within the chapel, layered tones, neither wholly human nor wholly natural, blending into harmonics that seemed to vibrate the very bones of those who listened. One farmer described it best. It was like the sound wasn't coming from their throats, it was coming from the earth through them. By midsummer, the aligned were no longer content to remain hidden. Groups were spotted further afield, walking the ridgelines at dusk, their eyes reflecting light like the gaze of animals. They carried no tools, no weapons, yet their presence was enough to drive neighboring families from the valley. No one dared confront them directly. They did not need to fight. They only needed to be seen, moving as one. Humming softly, the sound carrying farther than the wind should allow. The Lawson Chapel was no longer simply a hive, it was a colony. Its influence seeped outward, pulling new flesh into its song, extending invisible tendrils into every creek and hollow of the valley. The waters remembered, and now they were spreading. By late 1873, Reverend Lawson's teachings shifted from whispers of awakening to declarations of revelation. He no longer spoke of the waters as a metaphor. He proclaimed them as a living presence, a consciousness older than Scripture, older than man himself. The spring beneath the chapel, he said, was not merely a natural feature, but a conduit, an opening between worlds where forgotten harmonies bled into flesh. What unsettled even some of his loyal followers was the way he described it. He spoke not of God nor of Christ, but of those before the Word, entities who shaped creation through resonance, their voices carving rivers, raising mountains, sculpting the very bones of mankind. And Lawson claimed the spring carried their original frequencies, untouched by the corruption of later ages. A surviving page from his journal reveals the depth of his obsession. In jagged script he wrote, "The waters below are not silent, they hum with memory. I have heard them in the long hours. They speak as chords layered upon chords, voices braided into eternal harmony. They do not forget. They have been waiting for flesh refined enough to receive them. We are to be their chorus." During this period, Lawson expanded the rituals in the cellar. Survivors' testimonies, those few who fled before being fully drawn in, describe a stone basin dug deeper into the earth, where the spring welled up and filled the chamber with a constant trickle. Pews were removed, and the space was restructured into a circle marked with chalk and lime, geometric patterns spiraling outward from the basin. The air was heavy with moisture, the sound of dripping water, amplified unnaturally by the chamber's stonework until it resembled the steady thrum of a heartbeat. Participants were subjected to prolonged immersion. Some were held beneath the surface until their bodies convulsed, then pulled up gasping, only to be lowered again. Lawson explained this, not as drowning, but as purging, claiming the water was burning away the impurities that blocked their resonance. Survivors recalled the Reverend's hands pressing firmly on their chest and throat, fingers splayed in deliberate patterns. And afterward, they described the same strange transformation, the ringing in the ears now constant, the dreams no longer silent but filled with layered voices, the body itself beginning to feel as though it vibrated with a hidden frequency. There are hints, buried in fragments of witness accounts, that Lawson himself underwent something more. One letter from a neighboring pastor who visited during this time describes the Reverend in chilling terms. "His eyes no longer seemed to rest upon me, but beyond me, as though he gazed through the skin into the marrow beneath. His voice, when raised, carried an overtone, a second pitch, not of human throat. The air trembled when he spoke." And then came the sermons that crossed even further from theology into terror. Lawson began to speak of the waters not as mere conduits, but as mouths, openings through which something ancient might return. He told the congregation that the waters remembered the original songs, but required vessels of flesh to be sung once more into this world. Each aligned member, he said, was not simply blessed, but becoming an instrument, a body tuned to amplify the voices waiting below. The disappearances accelerated. Those who questioned him most directly were the first to vanish, their names marked in Lawson's surviving ledgers with the chilling phrase, "taken by harmony." No graves were due. No bodies recovered. Only the sound of water flowing, unending, beneath the chapel floor. Lawson had crossed a threshold. What began as worship now revealed itself as preparation. The congregation was no longer just a flock, it was becoming a choir, their voices shaped, their bodies altered, their wills consumed, and the songs they sang were not for any god the settlers of Arkansas had ever known. By autumn of 1873, the Arkansas hills were no longer silent. Rumors of Lawson Chapel had spread beyond the valley, whispered in taverns, post offices, and among circuit riders who passed along the frontier roads. Families who had once tolerated the Reverend's eccentricities began to voice concerns more openly. Livestock had gone missing, wells had soured, and the strange processions of aligned congregants unnerved even the most pious neighbors. The tipping point came after the disappearance of Martha Klein, a 16-year-old girl from a homestead 3 miles west of the chapel. Her parents claimed she vanished in the night, though her shoes were found neatly placed outside their door, and strange chalk markings, spirals interwoven with crosses, had been smeared across the threshold. The settlers accused Lawson's people of luring her away, and for the first time, a small group armed with rifles marched toward the chapel to demand answers. What happened next exists only in fragments, but every account shares the same disturbing features. When the men arrived, the congregation was already waiting for them outside the chapel, arranged in a semicircle around the spring. They were unarmed, barefoot, their clothes damp as though they had risen straight from the waters, and they were humming. The settlers shouted demands, but the aligned never broke formation. Witnesses described the hum as low at first, a faint vibration underfoot, but it grew in strength until the men's rifles rattled in their hands. Some later testified that their own voices faltered in their throats, as though the sound was stealing the very breath from their lungs. One man fired. The bullet struck a congregant square in the chest, but instead of collapsing, the figure only staggered, then straightened, smiling faintly as if untouched. Then, in perfect unison, the entire congregation exhaled, an eruption of sound so deep it made the earth tremble. The settlers broke. Some dropped their weapons and fled. Others tried to fight but were quickly overwhelmed, not by violence in the conventional sense, but by something far worse. They described the sound as burrowing into their skulls, a resonance that shattered thought, left them staggering and retching. 2 men never returned, and their names later appeared in Lawson's ledger under the same cryptic note, taken by harmony. The survivors who crawled back to their homesteads spoke in whispers of what they had seen. Their wives reported them shaking uncontrollably, unable to sleep, muttering in half-formed phrases about the voices in the water. One man tore at his own ears until his hands were slick with blood, insisting he could still hear the hymn. Dr. Holloway later uncovered a letter from a regional official in Little Rock, dated November 1873, which noted the disturbance. Reports of fanatic activity in Benton County are increasing. Claims of unnatural endurance, coordinated trance, and disappearances. Locals request intervention, though the matter appears exaggerated by frontier superstition. The official closed the letter with a phrase that reveals more than it conceals. The less recorded of this, the better. But the settlers who remained knew better. They began to speak of Lawson's people not as neighbors or even as cultists, but as something other, no longer men and women, but a hive bound by sound, protected by forces no musket or prayer could touch. It was no longer a question of faith, it was a question of survival, and for the first time the Lawson Chapel hive showed that it would not tolerate interference. By the winter of 1873, the Lawson Chapel hive had proven it could repel force, yet what made them most dangerous was not their resistance to bullets or their endurance of pain. It was their ability to infiltrate without ever lifting a weapon. The resonance had become not merely a ritual, but a contagion. Reports began surfacing of men who had never set foot inside the chapel, but who carried fragments of its influence. A mail rider out of Rogers claimed he heard singing while passing the Timber Creek Road at dusk. He swore the voices rode with him for miles, a chorus just beyond his hearing, until his horse collapsed in exhaustion. Weeks later, that same rider was seen wandering the woods barefoot, clothes torn, humming to himself. His route had brought him too close to the spring, and the resonance had found him. Officials in Little Rock eventually dispatched 2 men to investigate, a deputy surveyor named Thomas Avery and a church-appointed elder, Jonathan Hale. Their task was simple: verify the claims of fanaticism, record evidence, and return. They never returned. What we know comes from a single journal discovered decades later in the ruins of Hale's family home. Its final entries, dated January 1874, are written in a hand that grows progressively erratic. The first notes are simple observations: the chapel constructed with peculiar geometry, congregants unblinking, movements synchronized. Their singing is not song, but tone sustained. My chest resonates against my will. But the following pages shift into something far more disturbing. Hale writes, "The water beneath is not still. It trembles as if struck by an unseen hand. Lawson claims it is memory itself, waiting to be unlocked. Tonight he bid us stand near the basin. My ears filled with pressure. The sound did not come from outside, but within. I fear the resonance has entered me." The final entry, smeared D and barely legible, reads, "We are not listening. We are being played. The waters use us as reeds, as hollow vessels. There is no escape once the tone is inside you." Neither Hale nor Avery were ever seen again. In Lawson's surviving ledger, their names appear beneath the phrase, "Resonance achieved." The contagion spread further still. Farmers reported children humming in their sleep, repeating fragments of tones they could not have heard. Women drew spiral symbols unconsciously into the dirt while tending to chores. Men awoke to find themselves standing barefoot at the edges of creeks, staring into the water with no memory of how they arrived. and perhaps most terrifying of all were the testimonies of those who resisted but could not escape the sound. One settler wrote, "It is not only heard, it is felt. It creeps into the bones, the teeth, the hollow places of the body. You cannot shut it out by covering your ears. Once you hear it, it hears you." The resonance did not need converts to kneel before Lawson. It entered homes through memory, through echoes, through dreams. The hive's reach was no longer limited to the chapel walls. The Arkansas hills themselves had become an instrument, and every man who lived within earshot risked becoming another vessel for the song. The contagion was spreading. The valley itself had begun to hum. In her 1962 notes, Dr. Margaret Holloway describes an unease that grew the deeper she examined the scattered fragments of the Lawson records. At first, she dismissed the chapel's eccentricities as the product of frontier fanaticism, but the documents, maps, journals, and sketches revealed something more deliberate, something engineered. It was the geometry. Lawson's personal diagrams, recovered from trunks and attics of families long since fled, revealed a precise, obsessive structure. The chapel itself was not built as a simple meeting house. Every measurement, length, width, height, aligned to ratios carried forward from older traditions, echoes of sacred architecture found not in Baptist churches, but in ancient temples. Holloway noted how the pulpit's central placement, the semicircle of pews, and the orientation toward the spring all conformed to patterns found in texts Lawson should never have possessed. Most damning was a sketch of the land surrounding Timber Creek. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a rough map, but when Holloway overlaid the lines with compass bearings, she realized the chapel was the keystone in a larger design. The ridge lines, the creek bends, even the placement of abandoned homesteads formed a pattern that matched a figure she identified as the Vesica Piscis, an ancient symbol of overlapping worlds used in mystical traditions to mark the threshold between dimensions. Beneath the chapel, the geometry intensified. Surviving fragments of Lawson's journal describe his obsession with the spring's basin. The stone must be cut at angles of 33 degrees. The chamber beneath must echo at 21. The flow of water must strike precisely the resonant cavity where the tones converge. Only then will the veil thin. Dr. Holloway grew increasingly unsettled as she traced his calculations. They suggested not worship, but engine. Earring, an attempt to build an instrument out of stone, wood, and water. The chapel was not a house of prayer, it was a resonator, and the congregation were its strings. Her notes describe the realization in chilling clarity. Lawson's hive was not practicing ritual for salvation. They were conducting experiments in sound, body, and place. The human form itself was being tuned to frequencies designed to breach the boundary between flesh and water, between this world and what lies beneath. Holloway's unease sharpened into dread when she compared the patterns to other records. Ancient temples in Mesopotamia, pre-Columbian stone circles in the Americas, even submerged ruins off the coast of Asia, all shared hints of the same geometry. The Lawson Chapel was not unique. It was part of a pattern, an echo of a design older than civilization, repeating itself across ages and continents. And in Lawson's writings, the purpose was clear. The waters remember, the resonance restores, the mouths shall open once more. Dr. Holloway's health broke shortly after these discoveries. Her colleagues reported her trembling during lectures, her voice lowering when students asked about frontier religions. She retired abruptly in 1963, and her private notes, those that survived, suggest she feared not ridicule, but something far darker. She wrote, "I hear it now at night. The tone beneath the silence. I was wrong to study this. The sound does not die with the chapel. It finds those who search for it." What Lawson built was not erased from records because it was a scandal. It was erased because it was dangerous knowledge, an architecture of control, of communion, of summoning, and perhaps in some way, it never truly ended. The spring of 1874 was remembered as the season when Lawson's hive reached its fever pitch. Witnesses who lived long enough to speak of it described nights filled with sound, the low thrum of chanting, the metallic wail of Lawson's altered organ, and the constant vibration of the waters beneath the chapel. The valley itself seemed alive, as though the earth were humming through every stone and tree. By April, Lawson no longer spoke of awakening, he spoke of return. The aligned were no longer merely vessels, but instruments tuned for a single purpose, to open what he called the mouths of the deep. His sermons, partially reconstructed from Elizabeth Harden's surviving diary, grew more explicit. We are not saved by water, we are consumed by it, and in that consumption, we are remade. The waters sing through us, and in their chorus the mouths shall open, and the forgotten ones shall breathe again through flesh. The final ritual began on a moonless night in late May. Testimonies conflict on how many gathered. Some say 50, others nearly 100, but all agree that the ceremony took place not in the chapel above, but in the cellar beneath, where the spring's basin had been widened into a pool. The walls glistened with condensation, reflecting torchlight in trembling waves. The air was thick, almost gelatinous with humidity, and every breath carried the taste of mineral-laden water. Those chosen as vessels stood in concentric circles around the basin, their bodies marked with chalk and ash in spiraling patterns. Lawson moved among them, pressing his hands against their throats, their chests, their temples, murmuring tones that caused their bodies to vibrate visibly. Witnesses claimed the people swayed in perfect rhythm, as if strings drawn tight by an unseen hand. Then the music began. Lawson sat at his modified organ, its pipes extending into the spring itself. When he pressed the keys, the sound that issued was not music in any familiar sense, but a layered vibration, chords that seemed to pull at the sinews of the body, resonating in bone and blood. The congregants answered, their voices rising not as song but as sustained tone, each pitched to a frequency that merged seamlessly with the organ. The effect was unbearable. Those outside the cellar claimed the earth itself groaned, the chapel walls shuddered, and animals across the valley bolted in terror. One farmer watching from the ridge swore the creek changed course briefly, flowing backward toward the chapel as though drawn to it. And then came the moment Lawson called the opening. The vessels were plunged into the basin, one after another, held beneath until their thrashing ceased, but when pulled up, they did not gasp or choke. They emerged silent, eyes wide, water streaming from their mouths and ears as if their bodies had become conduits. Witnesses described the air filling with a sound that was no longer human, something like whale song, something like the groaning of deep caverns, something that made the torches gutter and the stone itself vibrate. Harden's diary records it in chilling brevity. The waters spoke, not through him, but through them. And it was not our God who answered. The ritual ended abruptly. Some claimed a fissure opened beneath the basin, swallowing water in a violent rush. Others swore the torches went out all at once, plunging the cellar into darkness while the voices continued to ring. But whatever occurred that night marked a turning point. The aligned emerged, changed, skin translucent, eyes reflecting torchlight with unnatural gleam, their speech halting as though forming words was now secondary to resonance. Lawson declared the communion complete. The mouths, he said, had been opened. But if so, then what had been allowed to pass through? The weeks that followed the May ritual were remembered with dread by those who remained in the Arkansas hills. It was no longer simply that Lawson's congregation was strange or unsettling. Now they were other. Settlers who glimpsed them in daylight described changes that could not be dismissed as imagination. The aligned moved with eerie fluidity, their limbs bending too smoothly, as though their joints had loosened. Their skin, pale before, now carried a sheen, as if damp even under the sun, reflecting light in subtle scales across the hands and neck. Children whispered that their eyes were wrong, pupils too wide, irises ringed with shifting shades like ripples on water. The most chilling reports came from those who heard them speak. Conversations no longer sounded natural. Sentences broke into fragments, each phrase completed by another mouth nearby, so that dialogue became chorus. When two aligned stood together, they spoke as one, overlapping tones layered into harmonics that reverberated in the chest of whoever listened. Witnesses claimed it was impossible to argue with them, not because their logic was strong, but because their voices seemed to drown out thought itself. And there were tracks. Hunters found prints along the creek beds that began as human but ended differently. Toes elongated, arches widened, heel marks fading until only web-like impressions remained, vanishing abruptly at the water's edge. At night, families awoke to the sound of dripping inside their homes, though no leak could be found. Sometimes the dripping resolved into rhythm, 3 taps, then silence, then 3 more, as though mimicking heartbeat or code. One settler, John Weaver, swore he saw Lawson himself at dusk near the spring, but he claimed the Reverend was not alone. Standing half-submerged beside him was something larger, its outline obscured by water yet unmistakably humanoid. Toe, erring and long-limbed. Weaver fled, but days later his wife found him staring blankly at the creek behind their home, whispering, "It waits beneath. It waits for us all." He was gone by morning, his boots left neatly on the bank. Dr. Holloway's recovered notes emphasized the symbolic pattern in these disappearances. Every missing settler left behind shoes or clothing folded neatly, as if discarding the remnants of dry land before entering the waters. To Holloway, this suggested ritual consistency, not random flight. They had not been taken against their will. They had joined. The land itself seemed altered. Timber Creek grew colder, its current slower, its surface carrying a strange, iridescent sheen under moonlight. The surrounding woods fell eerily silent at night. No crickets, no owls, no rustle of game. Locals said the animals had learned what men had not, to avoid the resonance. By midsummer, those who remained near Arkansas Hills spoke in hushed tones of an invisible boundary. Step too close to the chapel, and you felt it, a pressure in the chest, a ringing in the ears, the hair rising on the arms as though the body itself recognized danger. Some settlers claimed they heard whispers calling their names, though no figure stood nearby. The hive had completed its transformation. They no longer appeared to be men and women at all, but vessels tuned to an alien harmony. And if Lawson's words were to be believed, the mouths had been opened. What walked among them now was not solely human. The valley had become an instrument, and the song had only just begun. By late summer of 1874, the stories spreading from the Arkansas hills could no longer be dismissed as mere superstition. Too many families had vanished, too many travelers returned broken, minds frayed, bodies weakened, voices trembling with fragments of tones they could not stop humming. The local authorities, reluctant for months, finally acted. A militia of 23 men was assembled from neighboring counties. They carried rifles, axes, and barrels of lamp oil. Their orders, though never formally recorded, were clear: burn Lawson Chapel to the ground, scatter its congregation, and bury the superstition before it poisoned the rest of the state. The men arrived at dusk, approaching by ridge rather than road to avoid detection. What they saw from above chilled them. The chapel stood with its windows aglow, but no fire or candle was visible within. Instead, the light seemed to pulse faintly, as though breathing. Around the building, figures moved in slow circles, barefoot, heads tilted back, mouths open in unison, exhaling clouds of mist, though the night was warm. The militia descended with haste, rifles leveled, but as they neared the clearing, the sound reached them. Not song, not chant. A low, unbroken tone, like the drone of an unseen instrument that set their teeth on edge. Several men faltered, claiming later they felt their bones vibrate inside their skin. They pressed on. Oil was poured along the chapel's walls. A match was struck, but when the flame touched timber, it guttered and died. A second torch flared, only to extinguish as though the air itself refused fire. One man swore the wood was damp, not with water, but with something that seeped from within the beams themselves, a thick, mucus sheen that swallowed flame whole. Then the aligned turned toward them. No cry of alarm, no rush of defense, just a sudden pivot, as if a single thought moved through many bodies. They opened their mouths. What came forth was not a shout, but a sound deeper than thunder, rolling through the clearing like a wave. The men dropped rifles, clutched their ears, staggered backward as the vibration crawled inside them. Several vomited blood. One collapsed outright, his skull later found fractured without a mark upon his skin, as though the resonance had shattered him from within. The militia tried to fire. Shots cracked the night, but none found effect. Bullets struck flesh, yet the aligned did not fall. Instead, the wounds rippled and closed as water swallows a stone. A few men swore they saw no blood at all, only a brief glisten of liquid before the skin reformed. Panic overtook discipline. The survivors fled toward the ridge, only to find their path blocked. Congregants stood already at the tree line, though no one had seen them move. Their shapes seemed blurred, edges indistinct, as though the night itself bent around them. One militiaman later claimed the trees themselves had shifted, rearranging to corral them back toward the chapel. Only a handful escaped. Their testimonies, delivered to frightened families in distant towns, spoke of comrades swallowed whole into the spring, of faces stretching unnaturally wide to emit tones that cracked stone, of Lawson himself standing untouched at the chapel door, his eyes reflecting no firelight but the glimmer of water. The militia expedition was never officially acknowledged. County records list the men as missing during frontier conflict. No further attempts at direct assault were made. The valley was abandoned by all but Lawson's hive. And from that night onward, no outsider dared approach Timber Creek after dusk. After the failed militia raid, Lawson's hive no longer remained confined to the Arkansas hills. What had been local terror began seeping outward, slow at first, then with growing boldness. It did not march, nor spread by blade. It spread by resonance. In the autumn of 1874, towns as far as Rogers and Fayetteville reported strange disturbances. Entire households awoke in the night to hear humming beneath their floorboards, though no one stood outside. Infants were found in cribs murmuring tones too deep for their lungs. Farmers claimed their wells vibrated faintly, rippling even on windless days. Children began to vanish, always at night, always leaving their shoes or toys neatly arranged by the door. Search parties scoured the roads, yet no footprints were found beyond the threshold, only faint damp patches leading towards streams or ponds. Mothers reported hearing their missing children's voices days later, carried faintly on the breeze, calling from the direction of Timber Creek. Worse still were the dreams. Men and women who had never set foot near Lawson Chapel awoke gasping, convinced they had drowned. Their beds were soaked in sweat, and in their ears lingered the echo of tones that did not fade with waking. A merchant from Fayetteville, unable to endure the dreams, wrote in his journal before vanishing, "They are teaching us to breathe water. Soon we will not resist." Officials attempted to quell panic, blaming wild animals, fever, or hysteria, but the pattern was undeniable. Wherever water pooled, the resonance followed. Ponds grew still as mirrors. Creek beds widened. Rain carried the sound across shingles at night, each drop echoing like a note. The hive had ceased to defend its borders. It was reaching outward, patient and inevitable, teaching the land itself to sing. By the winter of 1874, whispers claimed that Reverend Lawson no longer confined himself to his chapel. He was seen, or perhaps only felt, in towns miles away, leaving behind silence and collapse. Witnesses spoke of a tall figure, face obscured by shadow, whose presence caused conversations to die mid-sentence and animals to retreat without sound. In Rogers, a tavern full of men fell mute when Lawson entered. None recalled him crossing the threshold. He was simply there, seated at a table in the center, watching. One man tried to rise, only to convulse and collapse, foam spilling from his mouth as if he had swallowed river water. Lawson said nothing. When the men regained their voices, he was gone, leaving only the faint smell of wet stone and pine. In Bentonville, a group of children swore they saw him at dusk, standing knee-deep in a pond, his arms outstretched as though directing unseen choirs beneath the surface. They claimed the water bulged outward, shapes pressing against it from below, like faces trying to break through. Adults dismissed their story until 3 geese were found the next morning, each drowned yet laid neatly on the bank, wings folded in symmetry. Even in Fayetteville, far beyond the hills, merchants whispered of him. They said he visited markets, touching produce, tools, even bolts of cloth, leaving them damp with condensation as though drawn from underground springs. Some who handled these items later reported dreams of the Lawson Chapel despite never traveling near Arkansas hills. Lawson was no longer merely a preacher in exile. He was becoming a conductor, extending his hymn through others, resonating with their fears, bending them into harmony. He did not need followers to come to him anymore. He was walking into their lives, one silent step at a time. By early 1875, the spread of Lawson's influence could no longer be ignored. The church hierarchy in Little Rock, already uneasy with the whispers of heresy, dispatched a delegation of ministers. At the same time, county officials, pressured by panicked families, authorized a formal investigation. For the first time, law and faith aligned against him. The ministers arrived first, 7 men dressed in black coats, their pockets heavy with scripture and authority. They expected to find a rogue preacher, perhaps a deranged sect. Instead, they found the chapel surrounded by silent parishioners who stood motionless, eyes unfocused, as if listening to something deep underground. When the ministers read aloud from their Bibles, the crowd did not resist, but repeated the words back in unison, reshaping the scripture into strange harmonies that shook the men to their bones. The county officials arrived days later with armed escorts. They found the chapel sealed, its doors chained from the inside. The air around it pulsed faintly, like the vibration of a massive bell. Horses refused to approach, and one deputy vomited after claiming he could feel the sound in his teeth. The officials left empty-handed, their report sanitized. Chapel abandoned, no immediate threat. But private letters reveal otherwise. One minister wrote, "We confronted not a man, but a system older than our church. Lawson does not lead them, he conducts them. The hymns they sing are not ours, and yet they know every word." The institutions had seen the hive and recoiled. By mid-1875, cracks appeared in Lawson's congregation. The resonance that once bound them in harmony began to strain, warping bodies and minds in uneven ways. Some embraced the changes, boasting of heightened senses and claiming they could hear voices carried on raindrops. Others whispered of unbearable headaches, of flesh twisting in places never meant to bend. One woman, Anna Whitfield, was discovered wandering barefoot along Timber Creek. Her eyes were clouded white, yet she described seeing more clearly than ever. Visions of corridors under the river, lit not by torches, but by sound itself. Her husband called it a gift. Others called it a curse. Within a week, Anna vanished, leaving only her shawl tangled in the roots of a willow tree. Doubts spread. A few families fled the hills, but most were trapped by fear or fascination. The transformations were unpredictable. Children grew gaunt, their voices carrying eerie tones beyond their years. Men returned from services with damp skin and a faint translucence spreading across their veins. Some stopped eating altogether, claiming water alone sustained them. The once unified congregation splintered into factions. The devout followed Lawson unquestioningly, believing the changes proof of divine elevation. The fearful begged to return to ordinary worship, though they could no longer endure silence without hearing the hive's hum in their skulls. And in between stood the hesitant, torn between loyalty, terror, and the intoxicating pull of resonance. Lawson himself did not intervene. He watched, he measured, and he allowed the fractures to deepen as though conflict itself were part of the transformation. The summer of 1875 marked the point of no return. On the night of the solstice, nearly the entire remaining congregation gathered in the Lawson Chapel for what would be their final service. Witnesses from a distance described strange lights radiating from the windows, though no flame was seen. Some claimed the air itself trembled, shaking branches as if in a silent storm. Inside, Lawson stood at the center pulpit, arms raised over the stone basin that channeled the spring. His voice, deeper than ever recorded, resonated through the beams, shaking dust from the rafters. The congregation echoed him, not words but tones, layered and spiraling upward into frequencies that cracked the colored glass panes. Water surged from the basin, spilling across the floorboards, yet instead of scattering, it climbed, clinging to the bodies of the worshippers like living threads. Eyewitness accounts diverge here. One deserter, hidden in the trees, claimed the people dissolved into the water, their bodies merging into a single form that pulsed with light before vanishing below the chapel. Another account, written by a terrified farmhand, described the worshippers bending backward unnaturally, mouths open, as the tones continued even after their lungs should have burst. He swore their voices carried from the spring itself long after the building fell silent. By dawn, the chapel stood empty. No bodies were found, only damp, warped floorboards and the faint, endless hum of water moving beneath stone. Lawson himself was gone. The hive had ascended, or descended, into something no longer bound to the surface. By autumn of 1875, nothing remained of Lawson Chapel but silence and rumors. The building was abandoned, its timbers left to rot, the spring sealed behind makeshift stonework. Locals avoided the site, muttering that even the birds refused to perch near its roof. Yet the strangest part was not the ruin, but the erasure. Within months, maps were redrawn with no mention of Timber Creek Road. Church registries omitted the congregation. County clerks marked the land as unclaimed, though deeds still existed. It was as if officialdom itself had turned the page, blotting out the memory of Lawson Chapel. The few who tried to speak, farmhands, widows, the rare survivor, were dismissed as mad, their accounts buried in archives or lost in fires. Even the ministers who had confronted the hive refused to discuss it publicly. In letters, one admitted, "To record it is to feed it. Silence is our only defense." But silence does not kill resonance. For decades after, travelers reported strange sensations near the White River Valley. Pressure in the ears, dreams of drowning, voices heard in running water. Children dared each other to approach the ruins and returned pale, claiming they heard singing beneath the earth. Dr. Margaret Holloway, in 1962, uncovered fragments of this erased past. Letters, ledgers, testimonies that spoke of the hive's rise and disappearance. Her notes ended abruptly with the warning, "The absence itself speaks volumes. It was not negligence but design." Lawson Chapel did not vanish. It was buried alive, still humming beneath Arkansas soil, waiting for those who dare to listen.